Good evening, and once again, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to another Taubman Symposium in Jewish Studies. We could not have two better people to help us understand the issues and the processes that are now taking place between my friend Raith Alamari and Ambassador Dennis Ross. There are several decades of direct experience with the Israeli and Palestinian conflict and with negotiations. So let me begin with an open question to the two of you by asking to tell us about, or to talk to us about why earlier rounds of negotiations were unsuccessful or were unable to achieve a comprehensive agreement.
If you look at Annapolis, you know, my problem with Annapolis was that there was good news and bad news. The good news was you actually had a serious negotiation that was done by the parties for a year. The bad news was, as time went on, the political authority of Ehud Olmert was declining all the time. After the Lebanon conflict, you know, he basically lost his credibility within Israel. You know, his approval ratings were in the single-digit area. At one point, you know, I said it was actually within the margin of error of the poll. And so he's then in a position where he doesn't have great political authority. Olmert has a parallel approach with Abu Mazen. At one point, he puts a proposal on the table, and Abu Mazen never responds to it. Now, you can say he didn't respond to it because he said, look, if I respond to it and I agree to it, I'm dealing with a guy who probably can't deliver what he's putting on the table. Do you think that Abu Mazen can ever agree to anything? Look at what Olmert was prepared to offer, and he doesn't even draw a response. And the essence of this question was, is he really up to making a deal? One of the things I've often described is in all the negotiations that I conducted with them, I always was struck by the sense of the weight of history on their shoulders. You know, we can sit here and we can be highly rational and highly analytical, and we can talk about the logic of doing this and why it makes sense, and we can talk about what is the way to resolve each of these issues as if we're in a laboratory. But they're not in a laboratory. They exist in a real world where all these issues, the core issues, and particularly the narrative issues of Jerusalem and refugees, are part of historic narratives that have been told over and over and over again. And you now, as a leader, have to take on history and mythology. And to say it's daunting is an understatement. So you require leaders who decide that they're going to make history. And the question is, do you have leaders who are prepared to do that?
I would say, first of all, I think part of it is that the issues themselves were not always ripe. We did not always know what is the solution to all of these issues. It's easy today to say that we know what the contours of a peace deal would look like, or at least we know what are the menu of options of how different issues will be dealt with. That was not always the case until we get to a point where we got to know what the issues are. But that took us time. And I would even say in Camp David, we were pushing and exploring some of the ideas. What seemed, you know, impossible at the beginning of Camp David, we actually had some breakthroughs. Jerusalem being one issue, where it became very clear at the end that this is an issue that we can work with. So I think part of why we haven't managed to get the solution in the past is we didn't know what the actual doability, what's the margin that either side can play with. I don't know, I think it's a mistake to say that we know the solution, but at least we know what are the range of possibilities on each of the issues, and therefore coming up with this, you know, building this jigsaw is not as difficult as it was maybe 10 years ago. The other issue that also you touched upon, Dennis, is the issue of political ripeness. Political readiness. And one of the actual, you know, tragedies of this conflict is we've never had the political timelines synchronized between the two sides. In my experience, again, with the negotiations of '99 until the collapse after Taba, is You know, at the beginning of this process, I think Arafat had the political capital to actually go and do it. He had built it up in the years before. He had built it up in the way he dealt with Netanyahu, and then when Barak came here. Yet, as you mentioned, Barak was busy working the Syrian track. By the time that Barak started paying attention to the Palestinian track, by that time, I think Arafat was already, as you mentioned, in shaky grounds, and therefore, we had missed that moment. Equally with the Abbas Olmert. When Abbas first came to power, it took him time to consolidate, etc. By the time he got to a point where he was ready to move forward, Olmert was gone by that time. Neither side truly understood the damage that they were doing to the other side by certain behavior. You mentioned the issue of the suicide bombings and the issue, and I would take it a bit even larger than that. And I would say, for the longest time, Palestinian leadership did not understand how the failure to really impose security, how fundamentally it undermined Israeli trust. But by and large, there was no understanding from the Palestinian side of how deep the issue of security was vis-à-vis Israel, and the flip. Of course, on the Israeli side, they never understood how damaging the issue of settlements is to the Palestinian narrative. I was at the AIPAC conference on Sunday, and I kept on hearing over and over from some of the questioners and some people who came after the session, all these arguments to convince me that the settlements are not the real problem. And I was struck, because at the end of the day, give me all of the rational arguments that you want to give me. I know for Palestinians, seeing the settlement expansion is the clearest indication for them that the Israelis are not serious. Politics is not always about rational analysis. It is about the perceptions, and the perception on the Palestinian side was the issue that settlements indicated the Israelis were not serious. So we had a long time where the two sides really did not understand what made the other one tick. Most leaders are just politicians who respond to the kind of incentive that any politician responds to. You talked about Abu Mazen and Olmert. If I was Abu Mazen's advisor at that point, I would have advised him to take the risk, say yes, and turn the next Israeli election, knowing that Olmert is over, yet say yes and turn the next Israeli election into a referendum on peace. Yet, this is the kind of leap of faith and risk-taking that you could not expect from your typical politician. And today, we have two leaders. We have Netanyahu, we have Abbas, two leaders who I believe realize, maybe not enthusiastically, not with great joy, but realize that they have to reach peace. Yet these are not leaders who take the kind of risk, these kind of grand gestures that we are used to. And I think this is where in this place, where you have serious diplomacy with leaders who want to move, but who are not willing to take great risks. And sadly, a public that is not excited by a process that they see as a slow process that is very from which they are quite detached. You don't see the ability of the leaders to excite the public as we saw in the 90s and beyond that. And I think this is one moment we're in, and I think if we start working on maturing the issues, preparing a public, and being sensitive to how certain acts on either side plays on the other side, we might be in a place where we might be able to avoid some of these mistakes that we had done in the past.